Okay, Barry and I are here at Camp Hard Knocks, and we just set up another sticky station here for tonight. This is the 3rd of May already, so we're here with res squatching, and we're going to go ahead and try to get some hair samples. We set up another one earlier, and we're real hopeful that tonight it's going to be real beneficial for the research with DNA. Anything to say about it, Barry?
No, I'm excited. I like the plan, and we're just gonna keep the faith, and hopefully things work out, man.
That sounds good. Ahu here at Camp Hard Knocks, and we're here in the land of the Sea Tonga.
Howdy, and welcome to another episode of World Bigfoot Radio. And we've got a repeat guest back with us. Once again, we are fortunate to have Rich Soule with us. And you guys would probably remember he's been on the show a bunch of times. And he's also been with the BFRO and done a bunch of res squatching outings. And just gotten all over the place. Been out with Igor Burtsev, Dr. Meldrum, a whole bunch of drop names, famous people here. And so wonderful to have him back on the show again. We always have a great time, and he is very, very informational. So welcome back to the show, Rich.
Dude, good times. Thanks for having me.
Always a blast to have you on the show, brother. As we were talking about here, and big surprise for everybody, I actually already recorded Barry from Res Squatching for an upcoming show. And since him and Rich do a lot of field work together, I thought it'd be fun to have Rich on before I aired his show to talk about not only the stuff that's been going on with him, but a little bit about what's been going on with res squatching in general. So I think with that, I'm pretty much going to say one more quick thing here, and that is that me and Rich both have swag now. If you go to World Bigfoot Central on Teesprings, there's coffee mugs available. Ooh, and they're awesome too. And Rich, what do you got available?
Yeah, if you go to my website, Knox Giga Study, I have all kinds of merchandise. But one of the things I have that I think is kind of cool that I've been trying to sell for a long time are some of the pictures of the structures, the Bigfoot structures that I've taken over the years. And so some of the ones that we'll talk about today actually will be there. They have like full tapestries, and I've put my logo on pretty much everything that moves. So they have everything on there. So everything for the whole family you can find. But if you go to my website or Knox Giga Study, you go to my Knox Giga shop on my website, you'll be able to find a link to the Teespring also. And you could pick something up at my shop and then head on over to Duke's or do the vice versa. So if you want to support us, that would be awesome. And why not buy a little something you could use in the field?
There you go. My question to you would be, are you making any of the prints of your actual pictures available? Because the first time I met you, you were at the Big Sky Bigfoot conference and you had an art gallery there of framed pictures. And these folks were just gorgeous, super high quality, incredible resolution, just beautiful framed pictures. So, man, I wanted to get some. So yeah. I'm just wondering if you have any of those that you're making available.
Yeah, I do have those. They're on canvas. They have them on posters, and they have them even as big as tapestries, like, almost 6 foot long tapestries that I put hominology over it, which I'm going to talk about. So some of those ones that I had there, the big arch one with the arch mound, I have that available. So I have a variety of stuff.
Cool. Well, let's not bore everybody with swag here, although I got to tell you guys, our swag is awesome. You should check it out. But let's get into the show here. So what was the first thing that you wanted to get us up to date on, brother?
Well, I had the opportunity to do some work with Dmitry Bayanov, and he's one of the founders of hominology, which is the study of these bipedal primates that are different, from Homo sapiens. And he had a long history of working with this since the early 60s, and he kind of took over from Boris Pashnov, who was one of the original hominologists also. And so Dmitry has done this for over 50 years. He's been working to get this working definition out there and history of hominology. And he had asked me to help to work with him on this project. And originally we were going to he had put a book out, The Making of Hominology, and he had asked me to help get this on Wikipedia. And I had I set up an account with them, and unfortunately Wikipedia isn't ready to take up this definition, although I think we have ample evidence that it's really great definition. They weren't ready to accept anything that they considered cryptid. And I think that's unfortunate, because I really think this is, we're separating ourselves with this. But I wanted to talk a little bit about it. Hominology is important to have some reference to this for anybody who's doing research, because if you don't know your past, you're not going to really know where you're heading in the future. And so it's important to have this perspective of what the past is on Bigfoot and these bipeds. So hominology originated over 250 years ago in the ideology of Carl Linnaeus. He came out with the first, it was a 2-volume 10th edition of Systema Naturae, which is from 1758 to 1759, over 250 years ago, which was the starting point of zoological nomenclature. So this is where we started identifying animals and other species. And what we've seen here is that he came up with, separate than Homo sapiens, he came up with Homo troglodytes, which were cavemen. And which is important to understand, a lot of the research that I've done over the years, I was able to kind of separate some of the understanding of the karst systems and what these systems are that they live in, more of the geological side of it. But Linus had this identified 250 years ago. Really, this was the subject was over at that point. We have the guy who defined zoological nomenclature basically saying we have Homo troglodytes. So I just thought that's fascinating, and so I was able to write an intro for this, and able to write to help assisting Dmitry Bayanov, and he had credited me with that. If you go to my website, or if you go to Sasquatch Canada, you'll be able to see The Making of Hominology, the hominology definition. And I really would like to see people use this kind of reference, because it does give us more credibility when we are talking about science. And there was a precedent for this over 250 years ago. So I think it's important to keep that context in how we look at the research we do from here on forward. And, if any people are interested in that, they should take a look at it. And that's on my website. One of the things that the quote that goes along with this is that I had found, which I thought was very interesting, when you look at the history, is Albert Einstein said, "The only source of knowledge is experience." So the premise of this quote, to me, is carried through the centuries as a living testament through the experiences gathered worldwide on hominids. And the knowledge of their existence is recognized in the science that is now known as hominology. So it really ties everything together from the past and brings it forward to today. Some of the people are probably familiar with some of the research that I've done also about contagions. And one of the reasons why I think there was kind of a break in that that understanding and these relationships of these hominid, of these other bipeds, because there was either famine or there was contagions that had created epochs through history. And when I first started studying this, I looked at here in the U.S. and there was so much information about Native Americans and smallpox and other things. And when these came in, the Europeans came in and brought these types of diseases, there was a huge decline in the Native American population. We know that for fact. Well, we also believe that affected the Sasquatch and all the other names of the hominids that live here. At that point, I looked into Europe and saw the same thing going on with the plague. The plague had an epicenter near the Caucasus Mountains, and that was where Zana of the Russian Zana story came from. And I was really able to tie some research into that. And so really, once you start getting onto this evidence-based research, things start building from there. And so all this really makes sense historically, I believe. And I think we're just in a great period of this type of research right now. We've been fortunate enough to have people like Dmitry Bayanov to bring this to fruition for the rest of us to take and work and move forward. He's 87 years old, so these guys aren't going to be around much longer. And the next generation of researchers are going to have some reference to this. So I think this was very important. I'm very happy with having to contribute to hominology and to get this definition out there. And I'm hopeful that other people will start using that, or at least get familiar with it and have a reference point. This was already identified through Carl Linus as Homo troglodytes over 250 years ago. We're just kind of tying all these pieces together and bringing it to fruition here in modern times. So exciting stuff. I'm excited to be a part of it.
Yeah, no doubt, man. That's a major feather in your cap being involved in that. And just to let the people know, in case they aren't quite sure who that is, Dmitry Bayanov is sort of the senior guy, and Igor Burtsev is his junior, who's like 80. They're both old. They've been at this a long time, and they are both in the Department of Hominology in Moscow, Russia, which is official government. And another side note on Russia, they declared Bigfoot as an endangered species back in 1965. So they're not as knuckle-draggingly stupid as we are here in the West. Another interesting thing that you brought up is with Carl doing his designation, taxonomic zoological designations. The guy that started taxonomic zoological designations thought Bigfoot existed and termed it Homo troglodytes. And subsequent to that, I've heard other references from other nature writers that have brought this up and have thrown their own hat in the ring for what this should be called: Homo nocturnus, Homo ferus. I've heard several other designations for it too. So it's kind of peculiar that we're paying zero attention to this scientifically, and the guy who started the whole damn process thought they were real and gave them a name.
Yeah, I mean, at that point, it should have been over. I mean, it's kind of like, questioning whether air exists. Does oxygen exist? We can't see it, but maybe it doesn't exist. Well, yes, it does exist. We all know it exists. So does Homo troglodytes. This has been defined in science over 250 years ago. The problem had occurred is, I think, these disease contagions and other things kind of separated our understanding. We have cyclical bubbles of populations being burst. And this is very common when you start looking in the bigger, macro system of nature, that we do have long periods of when we have population growth. And then we have periods where we have like the Black Plague, and we have smallpox, and we have other diseases. We have war and famine. We have things that wipe out large populations of people. And I truly believe this also affects the other hominids around the world. This is a global stratification of them being affected by these contagions and these environments. And, it's just, it's having that reference. And in modern times, if we're looking at, we've made them pretty much relegated now to the state parks and forests that are and Native American reservations, because we've basically used all the other land that's around there for either building homes or growing, corn or whatever, raising cattle, other industry. We've just kind of etched them out of a lot of the areas. And so we're living in very close relationships with them in some places. I know when we were up in Missoula there, we knew they were right around town. They were coming into town. I know the same thing here in Lincoln, the woods and the rivers around where I live here in Lincoln, Nebraska. There's activity, there's sighting.
Yeah, I have a guest that I yet to come on the show here yet that got pictures of one walking along the hillside facing Hellgate Canyon, right over there in Hellgate. Anyway, it's like he's walking from Missoula to East Missoula, and there's a Bigfoot walking along the top of the mountain, and he takes pictures of it.
Wow, that is awesome. So yeah, I mean, people don't need to go very far anymore because we've pretty much encroached on all of their, the land that they've been living in, these riparian forests and that are along rivers. And, we pretty much have an idea of what they would need to eat and how they would need to survive in these situations. Being living along humans, we know that they do dumpster diving as well as they're able to etch out a living in their own environments through the different flora and fauna that they can eat and all over the country. So they largely roam at night, and that's what makes this interesting. That we seem to live more in the light of the day, and they seem to be more active in the dark of the night. And we both have kind of gone on our ways through history this way. One other thing I wanted to point out about Dmitry Bayanoff and Dr. Burtsev is that they among a few other people were the catalyst for the relic hominid inquiry of Dr. Meldrum. They are the ones that really got that initiated to have Dr. Meldrum get that started. And initially it was going to be more of a kind of an international place for people to take information there. And I think over the years, Dr. Meldrum kind of uses it for his own research. There is some great things on there. I'm not going to knock him for what he has there. He's done a really great job with it. But the intentions of it, I think, was to be a little more open source for other people to interact with that. And I think maybe social media trumps that. I'm not sure now. It seems to be a lot of people more doing the social media than wanting to read a study. Someone like Jean Marie Kaufman, who wrote about the Almasti, just brilliant. She's 100 years old. She's one of the hominology people that you'll see when you look at this hominology information I have on my website. She has articles on relic hominid inquiry. So does Dmitry Bayanoff. So does Dr. Burtsev. And just fascinating history. There's just a plethora of information out there. But a lot of people don't have time, so they get their information from these little sound bites that we put out there, and we're happy for that. But I really encourage people to dig a little deeper and look a little further into this, because there's more than enough evidence to suggest they existed in the past, and they do exist today. And it's just a fascinating time. It's not going to be long before we have the DNA, I believe, through the research being done with environmental DNA. And research that's going to be taking things out of the environment, and it's going to be building up an algorithm. I'm sure at some point this is going to be isolated that way. My MUC7E research I've done through sub-Saharan Africa, and I truly believe that's their origins, that this will all kind of coalesce in the scientific community. So now we have a definition to help represent that in the scientific community when all of these things come together. So that's exciting.
Yeah, very much so. It's great to see, actually some combined effort going together. And it seems to go in multiple directions, too, because I know Ketchum is involved in some more DNA studies that she's doing right now. And those guys are doing some DNA stuff and are working with her. So it's great to see these scientists actually working together on this stuff.
Yeah, there is. I mean, behind the scenes, the scientists that are doing this are working together. People might think that Dr. Ketchum isn't involved in stuff anymore, but she is very much involved. She's very active in this research and continues to be progressive in what she's had put out there as far as the hominids being a hybrid. And I truly believe she was 100% right with that. I just was able to make a connection a little farther down the line as far as sub-Saharan African as being an origin of where these hominids originated from. But I think what we're going to see is the studies that's currently being done on Zana. There's studies right now with the skulls of, we believe they have Zana's skull and Quit skull, and we're hoping to have that verified. So that's something Dr. Bertseff is working on. We were hoping to have that done this summer, but that has not come to fruition yet. But when I talked to him just a few weeks ago after his Hanovia conference, he did give me a thumbs up that things are still progressing. We don't have the actual evidence from the labs yet, but they're still working on it. They've had them for over a year now. So great stuff is going on. And then I think that's just going to corroborate everything that Dr. Ketchum's doing. And of course, she's continuing her research. So, and then, as I've said, a lot of these studies that helped really reaffirm the research I've done has been research done outside of the actual Bigfoot community. This is just studying human DNA. And when they came into the MUC7, they found that was unique to sub-Saharan Africa, this MUC7E, and we were able to tie it into Zana and the research done by Dr. Sykes. Then several studies came after that, because really Africa had not had a whole lot of studies done genetically in comparison to other countries in Europe and the U.S. And they are really finding within sub-Saharan Africa there is this unknown hominid that had interbred, and it's very archaic. And it's running along the lines. It's even wildly different than Denisovian or Neanderthal. So now we know that Africans, sub-Saharan Africans, interbred with something that is wildly different.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Zana the evidence pointed that she was 100% sub-Saharan Africa. So fascinating stuff. I think these studies are coalescing. The algorithms that are going to be developed from eDNA are just going to make our research in the field much more coherent. When you can go in and we have a marker for something that's 99% Homo sapien, 1% unknown, they'll be able to make a marker for that genetically. And when you go test water or test dirt or something, it'll turn blue. The water will turn blue if that's the marker color that you want, or whatever color pink, whatever color you decide to make to identify that. So you'll be able to do studies in streams and be able to look and see if they're actively there or if they're seasonally in areas. There's just a huge variety of things that's going to be coming of this. So it's very exciting. We don't need to necessarily catch one. We could still do a great deal of study outside of this. So very exciting.
Yeah, interesting side note on this whole thing. They just did the same thing with the Loch Ness Monster environmental DNA. They took a sample from the loch and tried to see how many different species that they could find in there and see if there was any oddball DNA that they couldn't account for. So they're already trying to do this with other cryptids.
Yeah, I think this is really going to unlock it. And of course, the more they do these studies, they're going to develop an algorithm. They're going to have a database. They're going to be able, what originally happened in 2018 when they did a study, it was this Dr. Mark Evans, who's a veterinarian in England. He's been on some shows. He did some research in Bhutan, and he brought a French scientist with him, and they were able to identify these. Originally, they had some footprints that they thought, and it turned out to be an unknown or a known mountain goat that is very rare. But there was a mountain lake up in these mountains that they then tested. And within that mountain lake, which was very isolated, they found that there was something that had been drinking from there or was adding DNA to it that was 99% human, 1% unknown. So we already know there are markers developing out there. And so the more we do this sort of thing and the more they're able to make it cheaper for us to do it in the field, we'll be able to isolate this, which I believe would, that ratio is very accurate, 99 to 1, 99% probably Homo sapien and 1% unknown. That still gives a wide variant of what we're dealing with here. So I think that's going to be exciting in the future for us, and we're just going to keep moving along and having a hominology definition to go along with this. Something's going to finally get to that point where science is going to, a university is going to take hold of this, and it's just going to, turn the tables on everything here. So it's very exciting.
It'll probably have to be a university outside the U.S. as much as they like to put the clamps on anything that comes out in this country.
Yeah, very true. Yep. Yeah, so that I wanted to kind of start off with that and just kind of segue into a few things.
Well, before we go any further here, we're on the subject we rarely talk about of Yetis. What's your take on all those nifty tracks the Indian Army discovered this earlier this year?
There was some discussion about that. They appeared to be pretty large tracks. Extremely,
even like outside the range of Bigfoot.
That would have been nice to have done a test on that. They could take. That's what's interesting is they could take the snow in these sorts of tracks and put them in a vial and run a DNA test, this environmental DNA test, and you could find out what made that track. So that one in Bhutan turned out to be this rare mountain goat, but maybe the one in India was the real deal, or perhaps a giant if you're thinking about something like that, or the actual Yeti.
Well, they did a great job of documenting the trackway and everything and getting up there and measuring the distances between the step length and all that kind of stuff. But whatever it was really big.
Yeah, it seemed to be a little bigger than what we talk about normally for the Sasquatch or these other hominids, and that whole giant phenomena still I think is a fascinating part of this. You and I both have talked to people, and when I get to the res squatching segment of this, I can talk a little bit about a possible giant sighting there on the res. So
right. Well, where they saw this one, go back to it one last time, was right in between where there's one of the really difficult to climb tallest mountains on Earth and where there's a huge nature reserve.
Yeah, classic environment for that. So.
Yeah, and like where most of the Yeti tracks are always spotted, it's going through mountain passes. They don't live in the snow fields. They live in all those nice big valleys up there that nobody ever goes to. And there's plenty of them. And when they run out of food in one, they just go over the pass to the next one. And then if somebody's going through there, they find their tracks in the snow. And I think that's where where all the tracks that they've been finding have been. I don't think any of those things live up on the snowy slopes. I think they're living down in the valleys, and the locals will tell you the same thing. And they just find the track going in between the two.
Yeah. And I think that's what you're hearing from the locals. So I think you're 100% right there.
Well, anyway, let's go on with what you were going to talk about now that we covered that. Anybody that didn't look at that, go check it out. There was a whole bunch of stuff on YouTube. Yeti tracks discovered by Indian Army. There was a whole bunch of news broadcast over there bitching and complaining that the Indian Army should be more circumspect and shouldn't scare people with Bigfoot reports. Hey, they were just documenting what they found, man.
Yeah, absolutely. And that to have an army doing that, gives credibility to it. And
that's exactly why the news over there in India and some of those other countries is bitching about it, because it was too credible because the army did it.
Yeah. So, that's those kind of things. You love to see that when you have an official having an experience that they can't explain, but yet they documented it, and then it gets into the media. And then it's a real head scratcher for people because, they aren't supposed to exist. And here we have our lauded, army documenting this. What's going on? So, yeah, people, they do exist. That's just the par for the course for the rest of us here. But
yeah, no, we just kind of sit back and giggle when this stuff comes out. It's like, oh, let's see how they try and cover this one up. This should be funny.
Yeah, I mean that's why I love this and having some history of what uh, reference to history, because you truly got to know your history to keep moving forward with this. So that's why I just thought this hominology definition is so important. And I kind of want to talk about a little bit of history too. One of the things that has been a part of my research that as a Christian and my faith has really put me into a better place, I believe, to do this sort of research. And it's kind of funny when you go into this sort of thing, that's not what you would expect to get out of it, but it really is for some of us who've been doing this. This has made us much stronger in our faith. And I wanted to give a reference. If you start looking at the Bible, the story of Aesop and his brother Jacob, when he was born, in the Bible, it says when he came forth, he was red all over like a hairy garment. Well, that doesn't sound like a normal human, does it? It sounds like it's a little different, maybe.
Yeah. And then they tricked the father, who didn't have any eyesight left, and they put like some fur around the other brother's arm, so he felt the arm and thought it was Esau. Man, that had to be one hairy kid in order for him to fall for that.
Well, that's the point. When you look at this story, you read into it a little bit more. The fact that they used, I think it was goat hair or sheep or something, but it was something very hairy that they had to use. Well, that's simply not a Homo sapien trait to be that hairy. Some people are hairy, but to the level of having to use a goat hair and to use it not only on your arms, but the back of your head, your neck and everywhere where they put it on him. That story is fascinating. And of course, having red hair, being born with red hair, like a garment over his entire body, that is just, again, a fascinating piece. That seems like you're giving birth to a Bigfoot or a sea tonga or something. That doesn't seem like you're giving birth. And then the fact that he was such a hunter and he lived in the wild. There was no reference for him living in tents like his brother Jacob. He did live out in the wild. So there's very much a delineation between these two brothers. And in the Bible, God favored Jacob and really disliked Esau. So there's something to all of that we need to kind of take a different view of, even though the Bible is something that everybody's not going to agree on. This story in itself has some very interesting, very legitimate things in there that we can relate to our differences of Homo sapien and Homo troglodyte. The other thing that I thought was interesting, if I could jump forward, and I just wanted to point out that is very much a part of my faith. I do, when I go out, we pray, we try to create a dialogue with them. But we do make it very clear that we expect ourselves to be protected in these places that we go into. We totally expect that. And when things get bad, we leave. So, but we have not been hurt in those ways. So I think that's something that gives me strength. The other thing that I wanted to tie with that real quickly, just for reference for people, is the story of Gilgamesh also, which is the 5,000-year-old Sumerian story. Again, it's almost foreshadowing this. Perhaps the Aesop story came as a part of that. But it's very fascinating because, again, you have another hairy figure here that is present in that story. And so you're starting to see a series of things historically that are coming up. One of the things with, if I could jump back to Aesop, was he was an Edomite or Edomite. And if you go to my website and you look at the picture of that was on in the Vatican, and it is by Michelangelo, The Last Judgment. I have it on my website. Of course, you'll have that picture here when we're talking.
Yeah, we're showing a picture of it right now.
You'll show it. So when you look at that picture, encourage you to look down by the river. What you have in the center of the picture, you have Christ with his last judgment, and there are people descending and people that are raising to heaven and descending to hell, and he is making this judgment. And if you look along the river in this picture at the very bottom of it, now this is actually in the Vatican. This is, I believe it's on the ceiling in the Vatican, is where Michelangelo had painted this. And it's on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel in Vatican City. So if you look at the very bottom there, there's a boat. There's along the river, there is what appears to be underground are two, what they would refer to as Edomites, or two what appear to be hairy beings that are in this mound along the river. And, you know, we've talked about the rivers and mounds and living subterranean existence of them. Well, here we have it on the Sistine Chapel. You know, it's very fascinating that we would have this and that Michelangelo would choose to have that a part of this picture. So I think as we move forward, people need to have this in the back of their mind, of having some caution when they're working with it out in this field. And we talk about this quite a bit. You and I do. We raise that question. But I think really when you look at some of the researchers, I've had the privilege to visit with Janice Carter, who has done quite a bit of research with her family over 50 years. Her family had Fox and his clan there, and she had a lot of interactions with them over the years and touched them and was very much they were very much part of their family's daily life. They fed them. They got into a part of feeding them every day, and they get hungry and want their food every day, you know? So it was something I really tell people not to do. They did for over 50 years, but that just tells you, once you start something like this, you can't stop it. So don't get in a habit of doing that. It's a bad idea. I think her father was a farmer, and he treated it a little differently. But I believe he did call them Edomites. He did believe that the Bible version of this is who they are. So they spent a lot of time around them. I know with Kevin and Glag's story that you have highlighted, that relationship was very part of unique to their situation. And so I believe that Kevin felt very safe. But when you look at that interaction at the end there, when Glag had to defend him, when these male Sasquatch fight, it's to the death, without question. They're not out there praying to God and hoping that everybody's the good of all concerned. No. When they get together, these male Sasquatch are going to kill each other. Without question, they will. And I think Kevin's story was very unique to that. Also, there's a story with Janice Carter of when one of them came and they had to fight, and her dad actually had to shoot one of them that was fighting Fox. So it's they're very brutal, they're wild, and they differ from us a great deal. We cannot, I know some people believe that they're going to usher in freedom or whatever for the world, but I think you really got to be hesitant. If you're a Christian, you've got to read the Bible and kind of understand there is a difference here. And the people that have, my personal opinion is I am very cautious. I am not as trusting as some people might be in those situations. So anyway, fascinating stuff, a little trip through history. And people have the opportunity to go and look at all that. And of course, you'll have it on your website, or you'll have it here in front of them while they're watching. So I'll be curious to hear comments down the road on this, because I think it is something that we want to really kind of open people's eyes to.
You know, one thing that we should mention is the actual traits that were ascribed in these historical accounts, where, first of all, as you brought up, Esau was mentioned as being this great hunter, lived in the wilderness, didn't need a tent. Sort of Bigfoot-like in that respect. And then you go back to Gilgamesh, and a lot of people think that he was actually a giant, that he was one of the Nephilim. And he's got his buddy Enkidu, who completely matches the description of a Bigfoot. Again,
Yes.
same thing. Lived in the field, hung out with the animals, incredible hunter. Him and Gilgamesh spent all their time palling around killing monsters. They were like a monster killing team. Those two would go around and kill monsters, and that's what most all the stories about him are about. And where did he meet this guy in the first place? Well, he heard this legend about him, that there was this wild man and blah 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 blah. And being that he was the great heroic figure, he had to go, beat him up because he's a monster. And as it turned out, it didn't work out so well. Enkidu kicked his ass, but they made friends, and so he became like Gilgamesh's sidekick.
Yeah, classic story, and these are some of our first stories. I think it's that story.
That's the first written story known to the humanity that still exists. Gilgamesh got a Bigfoot in it.
Yeah, how can we ignore that? And how is it overlooked? I mean, it's absolutely in our face. Here we have them at the Sistine Chapel written in as Jesus, his last, the last judgment. These are very significant people. This is not something to take lightly at all. This is absolutely historical references that we cannot ignore. And the fact that people don't think they exist, and these things are very clear that they do through history, is something people need to wake up to. I'm not going to try to win this argument with people who don't agree with me, but I just encourage you to do the research yourself. Don't believe me. Go read these things. So,
yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the important things that people should center their attention on is something that this certain guy who's a big game hunter has been mentioning on his shows recently. And that's it. Look, we got way more than enough evidence to prove that this thing is real. Who is putting the clamps on it? Why are they stopping us from knowing about it? That's the real questions we should be asking.
Yeah, because I had some strange last year. My website was shut down for I had to actually get it started back up. But it just one day I went to log on to it and it just disappeared. I had a link to Google to to question and to find out why they had shut my website off. And the next day it just miraculously turned on. I sent the email like, what is it? What reason had this occurred? I don't believe I've done anything to offend anybody. And please tell me why I no longer have a website. And the next day, without any explanation, it was back on. So they could silence. At that point, it was sobering to me because I had a great deal of my research on, pretty much everything on there since I backed everything up. But they can shut that down at any time and with no reasoning whatsoever. Thankfully, they put mine back on. But, I've been in research areas where we've had black helicopters flying around. That happened after the Meldrum was up with us on the res. I've been on expeditions up in the Jemez Mountains in New Mexico, and black helicopters are flying around. Yeah, there's military bases, within 100 miles of those places. But why are they flying around that low at night when we're doing our research? It's kind of strange.
Yeah, a little peculiar.
A little peculiar. Something else is going on. One of the things I do want to talk about, and I think it's a good segue now, is the chief standing bear. If we could get into the Native American.
Yeah, let's talk about him.
Because one of the structure, I sent you a picture of a structure that is at the confluence of the Niobrara River and the Missouri River in northeastern Nebraska. And that is the ancestral home of the Ponca tribe and Chief Standing Bear, who went to court to get the rights of Native Americans as a whole, as a people, and get recognized as a people. As before that, they were savages. They had no rights, absolutely zero rights. So very proud of that, Chief Standing Bear. But interesting enough, I've done research there, and one of the structures that I found, there's a few structures that we can talk about. I'll have pictures of them, and a brief video I think that I have sent you. This structure is at the confluence of these of the Missouri and the Niobrara River, and the one structure is bent on a bent tree. Now, a lot of people have probably seen this. It used to be maybe told as a Native American marker, but a tree that's totally bent over and is grown in like a bent fashion. So this tree is, which I believe is an older marker. On top of it, there is a moving structure that moves on top of this bent tree, and it's probably about 8 feet. It's connected to one tree that moves, and then they are intertwined and they move together on top of this tree. It's fascinating when you see it. When I first saw that, that was just amazing. So I took videos of it. You'll see this picture of it. Well, I came back to that location, and you'll have pictures of this you can show people too. A year later, and I had documented this, and I had used to put my pictures on Google Plus while Google Plus was still around. I never had that many followers, but because I've always just shared things privately with people. Well, I had like 17 followers on my Google Plus account, and I had 150,000 views on it.
Yeah.
So you figure that out. People are sharing these pictures, and this was 2011 through 2018 or whatever, and last year when Google Plus disappeared. So it was fascinating to me. I went back to this Niobrara State Park, and the tree this is all federal land that is along the Missouri River. It's a scenic river, so the federal government manages this land. The tree that this structure was on, not the bent tree, but the other tree supporting this, was completely cut down. And so somebody in their infinite wisdom, after I had seen it a year, it had been there. I'd went there several times, and it was still there. It was in good shape. It was like Memorial Day through Labor Day. It was still there. The following spring I went, and it was gone. They just cut this tree down for no reason. And I sent you pictures of it. You can see that. Yep. To me, that was some sort of sabotage. I mean, there was absolutely no reason to cut that tree down, and they just pushed it into the river. I mean, you can just see it sitting there. They didn't take it away. They just took a saw and cut it down. And so I don't know if this was some agenda to cover these kind of things up, but I just thought it was interesting that was on federal land. And that was something that I documented, so people will be able to see those pictures that I'm talking about as we're talking. So
we've had that happen out here too, and I've heard that from other researchers before too, where they documented some structure and it was like in an obviously recognizable place, and shortly afterwards somebody cut it down.
Yep.
We had the same thing. We documented a bunch of arches and snaps that were going up a hillside from the main road going through the Skalkaho Pass, really easy to find. And we came back the next year, and nothing else but just those structures had been cut down. And interestingly enough, right underneath the where this was on the hillside, there was about a 60-foot section of road that had been freshly repaved, even though none of the rest of that 20-some miles of road had even been touched.
Yeah.
So I kind of get the impression that when they cut those structures down, they kind of ticked off somebody that kind of ripped part of the road out.
Yeah, that does not surprise me at all. And, when we take pictures, especially if you're using your camera, it'll have a GPS coordinates on it. And so when you do post those, you're basically telling everybody where they're at if you're using your GPS or, your camera for your phone. If you use a regular camera, you don't have that, but a phone does have that automatically linked. So everybody carries their phone with them anymore, and we're basically pointing, and when we're doing this, we're giving the easy pickings for whoever wants to cover this up to go in and do that. I know there's efforts been made in parks too to cover footprints up. I've heard people said that footprints were covered up by the park rangers. I simply don't know where this is coming from. If it's above them, most likely that's what's happening, but there is some effort to keep this undercover. And they don't want this sort of thing out. And so if they can, destroy them in the process, then that's what they're doing. So that's a good indication of before and after. You'll be able to see it for yourself, what they've done there when you see the pictures here that we have.
Yeah, that's just sad. And I wouldn't recommend it because it probably ticks off the Bigfoot when you cut their structures down. So you could be like risking your life by doing that.
Well, interesting enough, the other picture that I wanted you to show everybody is the one that is in a ravine that is in that same area. It's not very far from there, probably a quarter mile from that location along the river, and there's a ravine, and there's a teepee structure that is in that ravine. But interesting enough, it's woven at the top. You can see it woven. There's two trees that are woven together, and they're obviously a teepee type structure. Interesting enough, just outside of that is a very large bench that has has concrete like cylinders around it that had been in the ground, and this bench was carried from somewhere else. It was not in that location. So I think the response to that, most likely of their structure getting cut down, was ripping out the bench and carrying the whole damn thing with the concrete all the way to this other structure, 400, a quarter mile away. Now one can only imagine how heavy that is.
A lot heavier than what humans could easily manage, probably.
Absolutely. I mean, these are, when you see this picture, you'll see that kind of justification of this concrete pillars under this bench just sitting there outside of this teepee structure that is in this ravine. And you're like, well, how did this happen? Well, I think it was a pretty strong message, and clearly no human being could do that. And why you would want to do that is very strange. But I guess if you piss off a sea tonga Sasquatch, this is what you get. We don't want this. We don't want your tourism. And here's what you can do about your scenic river.
Yeah, it's more like, this is our scenic river. Screw you guys. I'm taking your bench.
Absolutely. And they had to have at least carried it a quarter mile or more to put it in this other location. So it was absolutely fascinating to me. So those are always entertaining, stuff like that. But I just thought, before we got into the red squatching, I wanted to highlight Chief Standing Bear, because last week was originally we were going to get together. It was an Indigenous Peoples Day. So Columbus Day / Indigenous Peoples Day. So I wanted to highlight that a little bit and just to remind people about Chief Standing Bear, the Ponca tribe in Nebraska, and the fact that there was Sasquatch activity up in that area, and they still are in that area along the Missouri River and the Niobrara River. So I thought that was fascinating.
That's one thing that Barry mentioned too, that there's always been Tatonga around that area, and that they've had interactions with them since, friggin' beginning of time, however long they've been in that area. So it's not anything new.
Absolutely not. Yeah, along the Niobrara River, it's very unique because it has glacial like canyons there that were carved out during the glacial period, and there's little pockets of these little streams and stuff that still exist there that have a type of trout that you can only find like up in Minnesota or something like that. So it's fascinating that these isolated little ecosystems still exist along this river, and there is viable ecology there that only exists in this area because it's so isolated. So the fact that the sea tonga, that Sasquatch could be in these areas for all this time, they definitely were there before the Native Americans came in there. I definitely believe that. I believe they were, if you look at my emergent homin theory on my website, I talk about them going, populating parts of the world, and then Homo sapiens come out later. And then that interbreeding happens at that point later. Well, it happens in sub-Saharan Africa, but it also happens with Neanderthals and Denisovian. And then you have populations like the Yeti in China. You might have a Denisovian that interbred with this unknown sub-Saharan African archaic hominid. And then you have the Aran. You have this in China. You might have, the Homo sapiens and Europe interbreeding with, and Neanderthal interbreeding with the woodwuss there, and the Bazajuan in France. And so then you have this hybrid, the differences. So I think we could see as we look back in our history that this is what occurred. Well, we know that also occurred here in the Americas with the Native Americans. They came into these regions, and interbreeding occurred as they emerged into those regions. But these hominids were already there. They came out of sub-Saharan Africa long before that. So, and who knows? We have footprints next to dinosaurs. So how long ago were they around?
Yeah.
We don't know. We know the Sumerian was 5,000 years, that text. So we know they were along for a very long time.
Right. Another thing, just to let people know, usually when you think of Nebraska, you don't think of this as being a place that's rich in Bigfoot. But that state has more waterways than just about anywhere, and they love those waterways, and they got the water and all of the trees and stuff right next to it and stuff. It doesn't matter if the rest of the state's flat and featureless. That's the area they're living in anyway.
Yeah. People probably don't realize Nebraska has the most rivers, miles of river of any state in the U.S. So we have more miles of rivers than anywhere. And, that's the big thing. They follow the river. So they have plenty of habitat. And then the aquifer that sits underneath the Ogallala Aquifer that sits beneath Nebraska is the largest aquifer of fresh water. And if we're talking of subterranean nature and these caves and karst systems, then that's ideal habitat for them. They can live underground and have water access and stay 55 degrees during the winter and summer. And they have the ability to back before we killed all the buffalo, there was a ton of buffalo. And I imagine they hunted the buffalo. I imagine they came out of the tall grass and just apprehended the bull buffalo, broke his neck, and just had a feast. Wouldn't that be an impressive fight?
That'd be a fun one to videotape, I'll tell you that.
But, the prairie grass was, 9 feet tall. So literally these hominid could be out there hunting and doing whatever they want. There was elk. There was all kinds of things here for them to eat. And there was plenty of that. But just like I said before, disease contagions kind of interfered in some of that, because I think that trading that they were doing with Native Americans, all that played a part. Just as Native Americans perished from their interactions with Europeans, so did the Sasquatch, the sea tonga. And I think we've seen that played out in Europe with the Black Plague. I think you're going to see it throughout Ogobogo, and when they had the Dutch sailors came into these areas of some of these islands. They before that they were widely seen, and then after the Dutch sailors came in, they didn't see them anymore. So you have a lot of these sorts of things happening that were cyclical in time, and these were happening over thousands of years and perhaps millions of years. We simply don't know. But we start looking at these at a macro level, you'll see these cycles. So very fascinating. I didn't want to get too much on a tangent, but I just want this to make sense to people of why it's important where we're at today in the study of these, that this is nothing new. It's just that science is honing in some different areas for the DNA, and we're able to start to validate a lot of this research that we've been doing for a long time.